Right, so welcome everybody. I'm really excited to have you here for this speaker series that's held in collaboration between the Inclusive Innovation Hub and the Institute for Science, Society and Policy at the University of Ottawa. My name is Sandra Schillo. I lead the Inclusive Innovation Research Cluster at the University of Ottawa, and I'm super excited to have Thomas Woodson with us today. Before we get into the introductions and presentations and our presentation by Dr. Woodson and so on, I would like to open this event as we do with the Indigenous affirmation of the University of Ottawa as our host institution here. And just for a little bit of context, I generally explain that every time for those of you who are new here. Let me give you that context, though. The Indigenous affirmation of the University of Ottawa is not a land acknowledgement, as would be given in many other places. And we're actually explicitly asked to read the affirmation as it has been developed. And it was developed in collaboration among colleagues and Indigenous colleagues and the Indigenous communities around us here. And in the spirit of how one would have greeted people in the past. So basically, when entering somebody else's territory, one might recognize the hospitality shown to them. One might honor the ancestors and living people who lived in that area and cared for that place. And one might acknowledge the ongoing relationship of the people to their homeland. So the University of Ottawa's Indigenous affirmation is developed in that spirit. I have it here for you in French on the left, English on the right, and in Anishinaabe at the bottom. And I've asked for permission, or asked whether it would be a good idea if I read it in Anishinaabe, and I was told by elders in the area here that yes, it would be. So I will do that. Manajiananig umawinini Anishinabeg ogog ka nagadawabadajig iwa ki eko weshkat. Akonongum egabikat ki negwewach. Manajiananig kakina Anishinabeg ondaje kaye ogog kakina inayagizijik inigokamega kanadang. Eji ondapinangik endawajan odawang. Inisidawinawananik kendawendamajik kije kikendamawan. Washkinigajik kaye kijayadizijik. Nigajibin mananig ogog kaningani songedeyajik. Weshkat nongum kaye ayanikach. Miigwech. And with this, I would like to just very briefly kind of just make a note of the Institute for Science, Society and Policy, just let you know the fantastic work we're doing. We've got work going on energy, science advice, inclusive innovation, what you're here for today, robotics and artificial intelligence. And within the inclusive innovation area, we have a bunch of research projects, training grants. We're working with collaborators in the food space, for example. We've developed a digital platform for food and beverage processors across Canada. We're collaborating with NIWI, the National Indigenous Women Entrepreneurs Ecosystem. The I2 Hub, not-for-profit, basically spun out of the Inclusive Innovation Research Cluster at the ISSP. It's co-hosting with us today. And super important, if anybody's interested in collaborating, we are working on a SHIRC partnership grant application on enhancing resilience, innovation, and climate action across the food sector, the entire food system. So if anybody's interested in this, do reach out to us, and we are excited about collaborators, co-applicants, and so on anytime. We're also building out a community of practice called Confluences through the ISSP, where we address the complex and issues of our time, and we aim to provide food for thought, discussions, and strategic thinking for decision making on those topics. So again, if you're interested, reach out to me. Yeah, sorry, Thomas, that was a little bit of a commercial here at the top.
No problem, no problem.
But we're super excited to have Dr. Thomas Woodson with us today. He's an associate professor at the Department of Technology and Society, Stony Brook University. And he also actually is a program officer in the Division of Social and Economic Sciences, then the director of Social Behavior and Economic Sciences. And he's going to tell us all about his fabulous work. I must say, I've met Dr. Woodson a couple of times at conferences, and we have collaborators here who've known him for a long time as well. I'm really impressed with his perspective and depth and his commitment to inclusive innovation, and he brings to it an angle that we don't always hear about within academia. Well, and we talk a lot about the funding agencies and so on, but we don't actually often get the opportunity to get a bit of a behind the scenes view on the science funding space. So we're really, really grateful to have you here, Thomas, today, and hear your perspectives, get your insights, and learn a lot more about how you see inclusive innovation and how this all works.
Great. Well, I do appreciate you inviting me here today. Again, Sandra and I, it may be maybe 5 or 6 years now at this point. We've kind of interacted and talked to each other. So it's been great. And I see some other colleagues here in the room as well. So I do appreciate this chance to come speak to you today. One of these days, I get the chance to come to Ottawa. It's a busy week for us in the USA. It's our Thanksgiving here in the USA, so it's a little difficult week to travel. But I will come. I told Sandra, invite me back as long as it's not deep winter time. So invite me, past April, I'll be there. So anytime.
And we're working on it. So we would love to have you here. And yes, we'll do it with like slightly nicer, but today wouldn't be really all that appealing anyways.
Yeah. I'm gonna go ahead and share my slides. 1 second. All right. So hopefully everyone can see my slides now.
Perfect.
So again, today I'll be talking about the broader inclusive innovation and the broader impacts of science funding. So this is a lot of this work was funded by the National Science Foundation a few years ago, and of course, any of the recommendations, findings are my own opinion and not the opinions of the National Science Foundation. All right. So I kind of wear 2 hats. My first hat is I'm a faculty member at Stony Brook University, and my second hat, I'm a program officer at the National Science Foundation, and I'll explain both of those in a second. So first, Stony Brook University. I'm in the Department of Technology and Society, and so Stony Brook is about 1 hour east of New York City. So if you go to, you can see on this map here, you see Brooklyn and Queens there on the left-hand side, and if you keep driving about an hour later, you get to Stony Brook. So if you're ever in New York City, come out and visit us. We'd love to see you and say hi. Stony Brook has about 26,000 students, established in the 50s, and we manage the Brookhaven National Lab. So if you do lots of high energy physics, you might have heard of us. Also, of course, we do mathematics is one of our strong suits as well, and of course, technology and society. We're the best for technology and society. So, but we'd love to come see you out at Stony Brook. A little bit about myself. I do, again, a lot with inclusive innovation and how technology can impact people around the world. And so at the beginning of my career, I did a lot with nanotechnology and how this new technology impact development. And since then, I've moved on to some other things, 3D printing, big data and AI, a little bit of that, and also STEM diversity and how we can increase the number of people and types of people involved in STEM fields. And so I have a variety of grants on that topic as well. In my second hat, I work at the National Science Foundation. This is one of our premier science funding agencies in the USA. We were also established in the 50s, and you can see kind of our mission to promote, advance, and secure science. So we have promote science, advance national health and prosperity and welfare, and secure the national defense. There are 8 different science directorates within the NSF. So we fund things ranging from biological sciences to geosciences, STEM education, and I'm located in the social, behavioral, and economic sciences, the SBE. So that in the SBE, we have a variety of different things. We have sociology, economics, science of organizations, science of science is what I work on. So a variety of different social sciences are found within SBE. So in terms of our numbers, how much we fund, so in 2023, we gave out about $300 million, about 20% success rate, 19% success rate, and we really do try to fund people across the country. So we are I've supported librarians, I've supported museums, I've supported lots of academics in the universities, but we do try to fund different types of scholars from around the country. So goals for this presentation, I will not be talking for an hour and a half. We're scheduled to 2:30, but I'll probably talk for about 45 minutes or so, maybe a little less. And then I really want to have a chance for robust discussion. I always find it more fun to actually talk about different things, especially science policy and inclusive innovation. I think it can generate such great conversation. So I'll kind of talk a little bit about innovation in emerging technologies, talk a little about some inclusive innovation frameworks, and then give some examples. All right. So as you all know, we have global challenges, climate change, inequality, war, refugees, and I'm sure you can name another 5 or 6 other things to this list of some of the challenges we face. And so, but we cannot solve these problems with solutions created in wealthy countries by wealthy scientists for wealthy people. There's no way, right? There's no way we can solve climate change by people in Ottawa and Stony Brook and DC. It's just not possible. And so we need to think, how can we make innovations more inclusive of people from around the world? And so I've been studying inclusive innovation, and really this is my definition, but Sandra may have a different one. She probably has written a few papers on this topic, a few books, but really innovation for and by people from marginalized groups. And obviously that's very context specific. The marginalized communities in Canada are different than those in the USA and different than those in West Africa. But one kind of characteristic often for marginalized groups is poverty. Most marginalized groups are poor. Oftentimes gender is also thrown in there. There's marginalized in terms of race or religion. So it varies from context to context, but you see some commonalities across these groups. And this is not necessarily a new theory or philosophy. There's plenty of folks talking about responsible innovation, appropriate technologies, pro-poor innovation, sustainability. So I'm borrowing a lot of this theory from some of these other people who did this work. And so I want to start with kind of 2 different frameworks, which I find very helpful for talking about inclusive innovation. First, the ladder of inclusive innovation that was developed by Heeks. And then of course, my own stuff, the inclusion-immediacy criteria, right? You got to talk about my own work. I find it obviously very helpful for what I've been doing, and I'll share more about that. So first, for this ladder. Again, the ladder now is probably about 10 years old, 2014 or so. So it's amazing how time flies by. But I've always found it helpful to kind of wrap my mind around inclusive innovation. And it's not only one type of thing. And so this ladder has 6 different rungs, from level 1 to inclusion of intention, all the way up to level 6, post-structural inclusion. And so I'll briefly walk through each of these rungs and talk about how does inclusive innovation work at that rung. So first, the first rung, level of inclusion of intention. So this is when the intention of the innovation is to address the needs and wants of the problems of the excluded group. But oftentimes it doesn't work, it doesn't happen. So there may be an intention to do it, but it may not actually reach that group. And I have this picture here. This was an example from maybe 15 years ago. At one point, there's this one child per laptop program. And the intention was, we'll give people in this small rural village in South America a laptop, give these kids in this community laptops. And the goal was to be inclusive. But quickly, it fell apart. So we know that maybe the kids didn't have access to the right laptops, maybe the electricity wasn't there, they might have broken down, it might have generated some other types of inequality within that society. This school got, but this school did not get it. And so a lot of problems arose with this program, but the initial intention was to be inclusive. So I'm not trying to beat up this program too much, but it didn't quite work out as the designers intended. The next one is the inclusion of the consumption. This is when the innovation is adopted and used by the excluded group. And so it's actually used and adopted, but it may not work as intended as well. So this is actually a picture of me. So you may well see me in this picture. I'm the person, that brown sweater and jeans all the way on the end there. And this is in South Africa. And I installed, but we went to a school there that installed a nanotechnology water filter system. And that picture in the background is one of the storage cases for the water. And it was a great idea. It was used by the school, but some of the problems arose very quickly. One problem was that this filter system was located behind a gate on the school property. And this made a lot of sense for a number of reasons. One was that it was protected from the community from being stolen or being vandalized, right? So it was great to have it behind a gate. But the problem with that was that the principal of the school kind of thought of it as his filter system. And so all of a sudden, for people to get water, they kind of had to go through this little gatekeeper to get access to this water. So that was a problem. Another problem, they were actually moving into a bigger school across the street, and they didn't actually make arrangements to move the filter system from the old school to the new school. So they had this great filter system, and they didn't figure out a way to move it across the street to the new school. So small problems arose. So it was used, but didn't quite have the intention as they wanted to. Next, inclusion of impact. So this is when the innovation has a positive impact on the livelihoods of excluded groups. And so this is kind of maybe a sweet spot where you want to be. You actually want your innovation to have positive impact. And the example here I have is this cell phone with M-Pesa. And some people here might have heard of these systems. It's a mobile money type of system. So if you get 50 bucks or 100 bucks, you can text message your family across the country and send money directly to them. And this is one of those examples of a great innovation that's really transformed the lives of people in low-income countries. Previously, to technologies like this, you'd have to maybe give your money to a person on the bus or to a taxi driver and say, hey, give my money to my mother in the small village. And maybe the money would make it there, or maybe not. And so this is a system where you're not relying on the honesty of a taxi driver or bus driver to deliver money to your family. Next is inclusion of process. This is when the excluded group is actually involved in the development of the innovation. So this is, again, moving up the rungs. This is what you want. You want people who are excluded to be involved in the innovation itself. And so in this picture here, it's just kind of a generic picture I found, but you see people working, building together. And so when we think about innovations, we do want people from the excluded group to be involved in the process. And I've gone to many, I'm from the USA, and as a excited 20-year-old college student, I was like, hey, I want to build this new technology and it'll solve the world's problems. And so I'd sit in my lab and develop something and say, hey, I built this thing, use it. And that often fails, right? So we want to make sure we train and teach people to actually involve the community in the process and not just us going to that country saying, hey, you must use this technology. Inclusion of structure. This is when the innovation is created within a structure that's inclusive. And so again, we're deepening this idea of inclusion. And so how can we change the structure itself to be more inclusive? So again, here's a picture of the COP, Paris COP conferences, and we just had one, as you all know. These aren't perfect. There's plenty of problems in the COP conferences, but this idea that we want to make sure that inclusion is built into the system. How do we even design it? If you take patenting, for example, how can we make sure the patent process is inclusive of other people? Is it only geared towards certain types of knowledge? Is it geared towards all types of knowledge? How do we evaluate what good science is? This is something I often care about. I got tenure a few years ago, and when you have this whole tenure process, what does it mean to get tenure? What's good science? And so we need to understand what that is and how do we change the structures so they're more inclusive. And last is this idea of post-structural inclusion. This is a little bit hard to understand because it's hard to see, but this idea that the frames of knowledge and discourse themselves are more inclusive. And we can see this. I think Sandra brought up a great example at the very beginning when she read the statement from the indigenous tribes in that area. 20 years ago, that would never happen. That never happened. That would never be the case. And now that is a very common thing to happen. That's built into the discourse of how we even start our presentations, how we even start our conversations, that we understand where we come from, who we are, and how the community where we're sitting is so important to what we're doing. So that would be an example of a kind of post-structural inclusion that's now the norm. And so we should think about how can we make sure that the structures themselves and how we discuss science and discuss technologies are inclusive. So that's the ladder of inclusive innovation. Again, a nice little again framework just to understand inclusive innovation. And I've always found it helpful and useful to look at that ladder. Next, we'll go into the inclusion-immediacy criteria, one that I developed and worked on. So I got this idea probably maybe 5 or 6 years ago, is how do you best analyze the broader impacts of grants? And so in the USA at the National Science Foundation, whenever you apply for a grant, you must talk about the broader impacts of your research. So this was actually required by law now, but you can kind of see this proposal and award policy guide. This is the rule book for all NSF grants. And they say that you must talk about how does research impact the world. It's very broad. There's not like a list of things you can write. So you may do education, you may do K through 12 outreach. There's a variety of things you can do. But the whole idea is that you look at the potential societal benefits of that research. And so I want to understand, okay, we have this requirement. Is it working? You know, how are broader impacts actually integrated into the research? And then how does NSF funding impact poor and marginalized groups? So those are the two research questions that drove this topic. So yeah, how is it integrated and how does it impact poor and marginalized groups? So first, that got me to think about this something called inclusion-immediacy criteria, and I'll break down what this means. So first, inclusivity. There's three kind of levels of inclusivity: universal, inclusive, and advantage status quo. So let's first look at a universal inclusive technology. So this BIA stands for broader impact activity. It's an abbreviation, so I should have written that out, but it's a broader impact activity. So these activities help everyone regardless of status. I call it universal. And so on the screen there, I have a little cartoons. It's a economist slash public policy joke. It says, give a man a fish, he eats for a day. Teach a man to fish, he eats for a lifetime. And then he says, overfish, and soon no one eats. This tragedy of the commons type of problem. And so if we have a technology that will maybe solve this tragedy of the commons, that would be a universal benefit, whether you're rich or poor. And so a good example could be maybe a new type of catalytic converter for a car, trying to reduce greenhouse gases. Whether you're rich or poor, if you have the technology that reduces greenhouse gases, that would be good for the whole world. And so that would be a universal benefit. Next, there are some technologies and activities that benefit the advantaged groups, or at least maintain the status quo. So the example I often give for this would be maybe developing a new fighter jet. There's no doubt that fighter jets have great technology. They are some of the most advanced systems we have. But in general, fighter jets will be benefiting the advantaged groups. These things are millions of dollars, and it help advantaged groups if not maintain the status quo. And in fact, military technologies are technologies that actually increase inequality. The whole goal of a military jet is that my jet is better than your jet, and that I can shoot down your things. And so there's actually an inherent idea of inequality built into these systems because they actually want to increase the advantage of one population or another population. So that's a different story altogether, whether that's good or bad, but that's the nature of some of these technologies, that they actually want to increase inequality. So that's an advantage to status quo. And then there are some technologies that are meant to be inclusive right from the get-go. And so they're designed to help marginalized groups. And the example I often give is maybe a malaria vaccine. And if you develop a malaria vaccine, that technology is geared towards marginalized groups if you develop this vaccine. And so that's kind of this three levels of inclusivity. The other dimension I looked at was immediacy. This is measuring how the research itself relates to the underlying broader impact activity. So this is talking about the inherent nature of the activity relative to the research. Again, I have three different rungs or three different buckets for this: extrinsic, direct, and intrinsic. So first, intrinsic. This is when the broader impacts are central to the project itself. So again, here's a picture of a malaria vaccine. And again, you can imagine that if you're a scientist developing a malaria vaccine, the broader impact is the technology itself. My goal is to make this vaccine, and that is my broader impact. So the broader impact and the research itself are very closely linked and go hand in hand. So I'll call that an intrinsic broader impact. Next, there are some broader impacts I'll call direct broader impacts, that you achieve the broader impacts while conducting the research. And the example I often give is training graduate students. Oftentimes in our research groups, we have this great project, and training the grad students is not the main point of the project, but in order to accomplish the goals of this project, you must train the graduate student along the way. So have this kind of little S curve where you get this broader impact while trying to achieve your final goal of doing this research project. And education is often fit into this category of a direct broader impact. And last, extrinsic. There are some broader impacts that we saw that are extrinsic to the whole project itself. So for example, if a top physicist decides to go to a K through 12 school one day and talk about what does it mean to be a physicist, that's what I'd call an extrinsic broader impact. Going to the K through 12 school has nothing to do with the underlying research of that person, right? She's trying to be, develop some type of nanotechnology device, and then she goes to the K through 12 school as an outreach activity. The outreach activity is great. I'm glad that she's doing it, but that would be extrinsic to her research. And so this allows me to create this 3x3 grid. I know there's a lot of stuff here, so we'll go through it slowly, slow but not too slow. We're gonna go through the things. I'll give you some examples. So I basically could create this grid of different activities that could fit into this grid. So you have again intrinsic universal, direct universal. You can I'm not going to read through everything here, but you can kind of get a sense of where things could go. So again, if you were training a graduate student, that could be helping advantage or status quo groups, and it's a direct immediacy. And the reason why I put grad student training in the middle there is because from previous studies, we know that most graduate students have parents who are also into graduate school or were able to go to school and college. And so graduate students may be poor for temporary, but in general, they are an advantaged group, as opposed to the one underneath it is training underrepresented groups in research. And so this may be, you're actually targeting underrepresented groups to do research. And so there's programs like that. And so again, I make this great grid. So now we have to actually do research with a grid. So, and a lot of these results are published in different publications here. You can kind of see those publications. And if you don't have access to them, maybe you don't have, your library doesn't have access to them, please email me and I can easily send them to you without any problems. So what do we do? So I want to give a shout out to my graduate student, Sophia. She's S. Boutillier. She's actually Canadian. She's from the western part, so she's from BC. And so she did a lot of the hard work. As we all know, I always take credit, but it's the students who do all the hard work. So we read 400 grants from 2013 to 2017, and we had this coding strategy, this inclusion-immediacy criterion, the IIC. That was our coding strategy. And so we read these grants and abstracts and encoded them for the different broader impacts. And then we check for intercodal reliability and those type of things as well. So what do we code and read? So here's an example of a very traditional abstract from a grant. And these are open source on the NSF website. Anyone can download them and read them. And so the first part is kind of talking about the overall research, what Donna Ginther is doing. And then usually there's a second part that highlights the broader impacts. And Donna Ginther, she wrote there what she was doing and what are the broader impacts of this project. And so what we did, we then went through and actually read these things and encoded them. So what did we find? So we looked at nanotechnology in particular, and we looked at 400 grants, or this was 300 grants. We had another project with 400. And you can kind of see how things were classified. And the most common classification was this central one, direct advantage. And again, a lot of those grants were dealing with training students and how can we best help our PhD students or undergrad students. The next common category was intrinsic universal. So this was research that was really helping everybody, regardless of status. And then you can kind of see what other things pan out a variety of squares. Let's see. Okay, I'm good on time. Good. And again, you can see kind of most common intrinsic, direct, extrinsic. Direct was the most common, followed by intrinsic, the next extrinsic. And then same thing, advantage groups benefit the most. Kind of seeing who benefits the most from this research. When we analyze it by millions of dollars, so again, each grant comes with a certain amount of money, and we can see, okay, how much money does it cost to get some of these impacts? And so you can kind of see there, you can see, per millions of dollars, you get 3.27 advantage broader impacts, as opposed to 0.05 inclusive impacts. And again, these are big numbers and small numbers, but you just kind of see relatively how important advantage groups are versus inclusive research is. Same thing with direct, intrinsic, extrinsic. By far direct is the most common, but then you may have some intrinsic and also extrinsic types of events are less common. So I'll stop there for that portion of it. I now want so that was kind of get my own research, what I've been working on. I thought it was useful and helpful, but I think there's a very exciting future questions we should talk about. And so I want to kind of bring up these questions, and then really that gives us lots of time for discussion. So I think it's 1:34, so we have a lot of time for discussion. So some future issues. What is the role of AI, large language models, on inclusive innovation? And this is something that I've been seeing a lot from my end at the National Science Foundation. So my current job, I'm a program officer. And so what happens is that people apply for research funding. And my job is to sort through these different grants and see what should be funded. And now, as you can imagine, the hot topic is AI. Everyone's talking about AI and how we'll use AI. And AI has some challenges for inclusive innovation. And the example I often give is a lot of these AI large language models are built from open source data from the internet, right? Wikipedia, that's the classic one. They scrape Wikipedia, take all the information from Wikipedia, and develop these large language models. I love Wikipedia, a great website. However, it has some very clear biases, right? It is biased towards the English language. No doubt that lots of English language articles versus French language or Swahili, for example. Also, the people who write Wikipedia articles are also biased, right? A lot of times it may be the stereotypical white male, right? So that may be the person who's editing and developing these articles. And so if you can imagine, I'll pick on an example. Let's say you're a big Star Trek fan. There may be a very good Wikipedia article on Star Trek, but maybe not as much on Star Wars. I don't know, something like that, or some other science fiction from Africa or East Asia, right? So, so that's a bias you may see in these large language models. And so we got to understand, discuss how do we wrestle with this new technology, especially if this new technology will be so embedded in our lives. We have no doubt that at some point we'll be making decisions with AI. They'll be writing our papers. I think many people here are professors and faculty members. And how many papers are being written by AI? How many policy briefs are written by AI? And so we're going to see it trickling into our discussions. And so we should be mindful of the bias there. Another issue about politics and broader impacts we can discuss. So there's a program in the USA called EPSCoR. And what the whole goal is that we want to support research from across the country, not just research from, rich states. So again, and so this program is to encourage funding for some of the less resourced states in the country. And in this picture, all the states that are in blue are EPSCoR states, and they're the ones that we want to make sure we give funding to. And so how do we understand these type of programs? As I think everyone in this call knows, we have a new president coming in a few months. And so how does his policies impact some of these policies like EPSCoR? In general, EPSCoR is actually a very popular program. As you can see why. I mean, a lot of the EPSCoR states are actually Republican states. And so I think I don't think the NSF is going to get rid of EPSCoR. In fact, I think it may be deepened. Our current goal, I think, is 16% of the grants should go to EPSCoR states. So 16% of NSF funding should go to these states. And over time, that will increase to about 20%. And so overall, we want 20% of all of our funding to go to universities or people in these states. But really thinking about how can we make these programs inclusive. And this is just one example of an inclusive funding system. It's not perfect, but it's something, it's a way to think about regional inclusivity. So another issue we have coming up in America, especially, is this idea of diversity, equity, inclusion. A super hot topic, and it's getting a lot of interesting pushback. And so this kind of shows two pictures there, kind of DEI is kind of breaking in. There's lots of discussions about maybe canceling DEI, what's the future of DEI. And so I'm not sure how this will play out come January or come next year. I know in some states, for example, Texas or Florida, a lot of these DEI departments or programs are already being canceled and shut down. And so I think this will have a big impact on inclusivity, and may have to think, how do you make sure this research goes forward in 2025, 2026, when politics starts to change. Some other questions, and after this, I'll be quiet and we can have a discussion. Some things to think about. How should agencies balance funding research with impact versus research without any clear impact? I'll pick up my pure mathematicians downstairs for me. They have to include broader impacts in their research. There's no doubt that that's part of the law of the land. But obviously, the impacts of a pure mathematician may be different than the impacts of a social scientist. The research that we do in my program, the science to science has very clear broader impacts. I mean, this stuff gets turned into policy memos and policy briefs. We're talking about things, how do we change science communication? These are things we focus on. And so very clear broader impacts. But as a science funding agency, how do we approach this idea of impact versus no impact? Where's that line? How do we draw it? And it's not an easy thing to think about. Local versus global needs. Again, the NSF is a large organization. However, we are taxpayer funded. And so my job is to make sure that USA taxpayer dollars goes to fund research that benefits USA taxpayers. And so that means we fund research on corn and not research on cassava, right? Because corn is a big deal for the USA and cassava is not. So, but obviously doing some research on cassava is important. If we only fund research on corn, if there's some issue with corn, we should know what's happening with cassava, right? We should know what's going on with that plant and understand that plant. But how do you balance those things? And I think for science agencies, this is a challenge. So we can talk more about that. And again, the time, how do you evaluate research? I think, again, it's a challenge for science agencies. It's a challenge for politicians and for policymakers. What time span do we evaluate them? In this project that I discussed, the time span was a year or two. Basically, we evaluated the abstracts. And these abstracts were written by the PIs themselves once the project was up and running. And so we evaluated the project right away. What were the broader impacts they proposed? And then we also looked at the broader impacts of the outcome, the final report they produced. And so we could really understand the broader impacts right at that time. But of course, broader impacts take time. It could be years, if not decades, for research to have impact. And so how do you understand the impacts of research? All right, so that's it for me. I'll stop my share.
Actually, can you leave the hold on? Can you leave the slides up for a second?
Oh, yes. Let me go back again. Slide again.
Sorry.
No problem.
So first of all, round of applause. Thank you very much. Really appreciate the presentation. Could you just for 1 second, because there were a couple of people who had some, or we had some technical issues here. Can you just go up for a second? So you first talked about the ladder of inclusion, Higgs. In our Inclusive Innovation Speaker Series, I think we've mentioned the Higgs and Foster and other ladder a number of times. So thank you for bringing that in. I love the examples you had there. Can you take us back to that 3x3 grid?
Yes.
And while you do that, Mark, think about whether you would like me to ask you questions, or if you want to unmute yourself and which question you want to ask first, coming to you in a second. So I love this. Honestly, I find this super compelling. I find this IIC framework super compelling, and can honestly can totally relate to it with my own research. There are things that I do that, you know, like fall into yeah, probably most of these. Um, Probably the middle part is the part that we don't necessarily kind of do consciously and think about. um, but very much, I think when it's extrinsic, it, you know, we kind of hear about it from colleagues and the dean on occasion, as in, you know, do you really need to be doing that? And yes, we do. It's part of the university's mission mandate, actually. Um, so I find it super compelling that you're splitting it out this way so that we can actually have these kinds of conversations. So thanks for coming back to this slide. I have a gazillion questions, but I'm seeing people coming on here and I don't want to hog the floor here. So Claudia, I'm assuming you're coming on because you have a question, but we have two questions from Mark in the chat first. Mark, did you want to ask, come on and ask them, or would you like me to read them for you?
No, you go ahead, Sandra.
Okay, awesome. Okay, so the first question was, sorry, Thomas, there's side conversations. People are pretty excited. So hold on. The top one was, how can research funding and projects be made more inclusive right at the start with the structure and governance of the funding organizations themselves?
Yeah, great question. I think this, a lot of it comes down to, you know, obviously the interest of the PIs. I think some PIs are interested in inclusive research and rewarding that. I think if they know that my research will be inclusive from the start, or it will have a higher chance of being funded from the start, that may encourage more inclusive research. And the example I give would be in South Africa. I spent some time in South Africa, and in their nanotechnology strategy, they had certain goals. Like they were funding health, energy, and minerals, I believe. So certain different sectors. And they said, we want our research in the nanotechnology space to fund these particular sectors. And so they're very explicit about that. South Africa, I'm not sure if anyone knows kind of the history of South Africa. It's probably a very common story, but it's kind of a middle income country, but had the apartheid history, a lot of poverty, a lot of inequality. If you go to South Africa, you'll see the wealthiest parts of the world there, some beautiful, most beautiful vineyards and fancy cars. And then you go across the street and you'll see townships and very, very, very poor communities. And so you see this inequality. And so for the nanotechnology strategy they developed, they very explicitly said, we want research to be geared towards poverty issues and geared towards our sectors. And so they kind of built in this inclusive framework into how they even funded things. And that could be a way to do that within the structure, changing the structure. And I think that could be one way of going about that. Well, I'm trying to make sure I got the question right. I'm part in the States now, so I can speak a lot about the USA and our context and our structure. As a program officer, this is something I have to think about. How do we make sure that what I'm funding has broader impacts, and what does that look like? And a lot of that is actually outreach on my part. I want to make sure the larger science community understands what broader impacts are and why they're important. It's great to have this in law, but if the assistant professor, if the grad student doesn't know how to write grants thinking about broader impacts, then they don't get it done. And all scientists can have some broader impacts, and it's not all the same. It may not be developing a water filter system. It could be along the lines of, hey, I'm going to train graduate students. I'm going to reach out to different communities for grad students. I'm a mathematician. Instead of only recruiting at Stanford, Harvard, and MIT, hey, I'm going to go to a smaller school in a rural community and say, hey, what do you think about math? Or go to people in West Africa or in India. I mean, there's great mathematicians all over the place. And so looking at recruiting from the different communities, that's one thing that we can do from on my end. So I'll go to the next question. Okay, so I think this is also from Mark. How is the blowback / pushback against DEI affecting inclusivity of research funding and the projects, and what can be done about this pushback? Well, how's it affecting the grants? I think there is a chill being put on some scholars, how they frame their research. I think some scholars are saying, okay, I'm not going to use the term DEI. In fact, it's been kind of banned in some states, right? They're cutting DEI offices explicitly, and so that is putting an effect on things. But I do think there's other ways we can talk about inclusivity. I think we often think about maybe race or gender, which are two major issues of inclusivity. But as I showed you with the EPSCoR states, some of our Republican states are poorer than some of our Democratic states. And so there's no doubt that people in poorer states, they want research to come to their state too. And so, and that's an important aspect of inclusivity, regional inclusivity. And so making sure that we are thinking holistically about inclusivity and saying, hey, yes, we care about race and gender. Those are very, very important. We also care about regional inequality and also educational inequality. I think in the USA, we're starting to see these interesting trends of parties shifting and morphing based on education levels. And I think that's something that we should think about. What can be done about it? I think it's, educating politicians, educating voters about the importance of diversity and inclusion. That sometimes we think, oh, we sometimes look at the world as, if they have it, I don't have it. It's a winner take all system. And I really do think that the more people we have involved in science, it benefits everybody. We want as many different types of people involved in science, doing scientific research, developing this technology. So hopefully we can teach and train more people that, yes, we want more people involved in science. But great questions. Anything you want to add, Sandra, or anyone else? I think we have lots of scholars in this room too. So I don't want to just talk the whole time. So what do you think, folks?
Well, actually, I would love to jump in, except that we have a bunch of people waiting to also jump in. So they're doing it in the chat a little bit more than in person. Claudia is ceding the floor right now to the questions in the chat here. So don't worry, we'll get to more of a conversation. Can we just from Louise, the next question actually relates to the framework you've got on the slide here. How does or should the ISC framework relate to science funding that does not meet current policy directives? Will it lead to undone science as researchers direct their projects to receive funding?
Yeah, this is where I think as policymakers, we should be very, very careful when we get too prescriptive about broader impacts. And this is where the NSF, I think, was pretty smart about how they approached it. They didn't tell people, these are your broader impacts. They were very clear, like, no, there's tons about broader impacts. We're not going to give you a list of them. Be creative. And they wanted people to be creative with the types of broader impacts. Now, the downside of that is that people didn't know what they're talking about. They're like, okay, I guess I'll train a grad student. That's creative. And so sometimes scientists weren't very creative at all. They kind of stuck with what they knew. And so, but thinking as policymakers, how do we make sure that again, the South Africa example where they were very prescriptive versus maybe the USA very less prescriptive. And both have benefits and both have reasons to exist. But just be mindful of, as you develop these policies, how will that impact science? So how does it? So in terms of how does it not meet the policy directives? So if a person writes a grant to the NSF and doesn't have broader impacts, they shouldn't be funded. That is the rule of the law of the land. Now, different directorates may approach this slightly differently. Some may say, well, broader impacts are important, but we truly care about the intellectual merit. That's, again, there's two criteria, intellectual merit and broader impacts. And they may focus a lot more on intellectual merit. That's kind of the science of it. Even though they're not supposed to do that, they may kind of weigh the intellectual merit heavier. That does happen. And so we have to be mindful that that may happen and, again, train the program officers and in the peer review panel. It's all about peer review panelists that no broader impacts are important. Will this lead to undone science as researchers write and direct their projects to receive funding? Yes, it can definitely lead to undone science. For sure. Is that good or bad? In some sense, in South Africa, we had fewer resources. They may say, you know what, we can't invest in all types of science. We can't let all flowers flourish. We got to cut something off. And sometimes they say, no, we don't want to do that. This USA is a very large country. We have relatively more money than South Africa. And so we may say, hey, we don't want to be too prescriptive. And we really want to let all flowers flourish. So yeah, that could be the case. Great question, Louise.
Awesome, thank you. And is it okay if I take your slides down now? That was
Yes. Oh yes,
question
please. Let me
about the
stop that. Yes.
oh,
Great. I'll stop
can do that
sharing.
here. There you go. Okay, moving to Nell's question here. Too often funding and assessment of projects are constrained by the early definition of outcomes. So timing issue here. When being inclusive, ultimate outcomes may be very different from the initial concept, as the participants bring a different interpretation to the desired outcome. How can this be addressed? So removing constraints too early definition of outcomes.
Yeah, this is a challenging one. This is I have two hats, my funder hat and my professor hat. So as a funder, at the NSF at least, basically once you get the money, you're free. We don't do too much on the back end, checking on you and saying, did you do what you're supposed to do? We kind of give you the money and say, we trust you, go off and do science. And the reason why we do that is that science doesn't always work. And so we want people to feel like they have the freedom to say, we tried it, it didn't work. Our outcome is a null outcome. There's zero. It didn't work. And that actually is a scientific result. And so we want people to have that freedom to do that. And if you check in on them every 6 months, that changes that dynamic a little bit. So that's one challenge with evaluations. How do we evaluate that? So, but then I think there should be another way that we can do evaluations every 5 to 10 years. And I think there are academics, probably some in this room, who are doing that, who go off and take 10 years worth of NSF data or whatever else and say, okay, how many patents have been produced? Like the classic bibliometricians, right? Counting patents and publications and evaluating things like that. And so that could be one way of looking at it. Obviously, the challenge with some of these evaluations is that it doesn't look at the broader impacts. It looks at patents and publications. We can measure those quickly, but who benefits from that research? It's hard to get to that data. So that could be one challenge. I'm reading the question again as you're saying, as I'm making sure I hit all the answers. What do you think, Nell?
Yeah, you hit all of them, and I find it interesting. And so could you convince everybody else to do the same thing? Governments, everybody, to kind of be looser on the outcomes? Because I find that's one of the biggest barriers to inclusion. Great, you have a project, you get the funding, then you get the inclusion, and then all the outcomes change.
Yeah.
And then people aren't happy because you didn't do the original outcomes. So
yeah. And now I did another study, a follow-up study of this. We actually looked at the abstracts versus the final report and seeing, did they do what they said they'll do? And no surprise, they did not. In their proposal, you always have great dreams. We're going to conquer the world. And then when you start the project, it doesn't quite turn out that way. So that's very, very, very common. So
thank you.
No problem. Great question.
Yeah, it's a challenging context. Claudia, did you want to come back in with your question?
Yes, and thank you, Thomas. And it's nice to see you in this different setting. I'm really curious about how do you see the future of kind of like all of these discussions on EDI in the US. I really don't understand under what context it has been banned in some states, or yeah, you cannot even use it. And when I think about the context, for example, about SHRC, like the Social Science and Humanities Research Council, academic evaluators, we have to go under kind of like some training about EDI to make sure that we are assessing the grants under those that kind of like that umbrella. So what is going to happen in the US? Like what kind of priorities are going to be observed, and also within the scholars that focus or that study inclusive innovation, is that going to change the mindset? You're not going to be an inclusive innovation scholar anymore.
Yeah.
Or what will happen?
Great question. I mean, I do think there'll be more emphasis on economic progress. I think we all like money. We're Americans. We love some money, right? As much money as you can. So I do think you're going to see, kind of this going back to, we're going to emphasize the economic value of this research. And so I think that could be something that you highlight more of. we want to help this underserved community. And in the States, oftentimes underserved communities are often correlated with Black and brown communities. And so there may be emphasis on helping economic development, which is very important too. That's not a small thing. So economic development. I do. So I have friends and scholars in Texas and Florida. Texas and Florida are kind of, I think, are really at the forefront of canceling some of these DEI programs. And so because this USA is so large, we have different states. Some states are actually leaning into DEI things. And so I'm from New York State, that's my home state. And New York State is a very democratic state, very liberal state. And so we have a strong diversity policies, and we're trying to encourage more diversity policies. And they were, at one point, they were very explicit, trying to take professors from Texas and Florida to bring them to Stony Brook so they can do diversity research. And so I think in some contexts, it will never end. It may shift around here and there, but it will still go on. Now at the federal level, that's a different story because again, there's one president of the United States, and so how do they shape the agenda? And so the president obviously has lots of power to say what they want and set an agenda, but also since it's a big bureaucracy, it can be a slow-moving ship, and it's hard to really change things once they're in place. And for example, the broader impacts, which are part of the NSF, that's written into law. And so the president can't just stop research grants from having that because that's written into the law. So I think this comes into law. I'm more interested and concerned about I think the rhetoric will change. I think, you've seen a lot of racism kind of pop up. I mean, things you would have seen 20 years ago, people with Nazi flags walking around streets. And you see this type of stuff, which if this would have happened 20, 30 years ago, this would have never come up, but now it's happening. So I do worry that the rhetoric will change in the States and how people talk about other people will change a lot. And that has a big impact on, communities. So that's something we'll see what happens there. Well, how about in Canada, in your context? Is this the same thing? Are you seeing the same type of rhetoric changing versus immigrants and that kind of thing?
It's interesting because we have a big housing crisis, and unemployment rates within the young population are skyrocketing, at least in Nova Scotia, in Halifax. So there has been like some backlash, well, not backlash, like some new regulations around immigration. So now many of the programs that were kind of like easy entry, I shouldn't say that, like would accept many immigrants and kind of like that students that then could move their visa from a student visa to a open work visa. Those programs are being closed. Right. Also, we have a limited number of student immigration visas into the country. So those kind of things that the government is saying that this is just too necessary to aid with the housing crisis, which, yes, you have more demand, you don't have enough houses, and also the ones that are there are not affordable. They are very expensive, and rents having increased. So I think it's kind of like a pushback between society and so on, but also, I mean, we know that yes, economic development is important, but you don't have equal distribution if you don't plan that ex ante. So I'm kind of like really concerned about about where we're going.
Yeah, it's a lot of unknown. I think there is. I'm not sure if you're here, Claudia, for this kind of a pre-discussion we're talking about, but there is concern amongst a lot of bureaucrats in America. What's going to happen next? I do think that the science agencies are more protected. My current director, he is a Trump appointee, and so it's unlikely that Trump will come in and take away his own Trump appointee. He's appointed for a 6-year term. So I think that the National Science Foundation, in one sense, will be fine politically. And again, in general, people like science, left and right, north and south, like science. I think that's not a challenging thing to say. We want more science. And in fact, the reason why you have cell phones and Zoom and all that kind of stuff is through science. So most people can recognize, yes, science is good. And so I think the science agencies will be hopefully fine. I think other institutions in America may face more challenges than the US, than the science agencies. So, but we'll see for sure. I think Mark had a question.
Yeah, yeah.
Are
So Mark's
marginalized
question was, are marginalized people and or representatives of the communities impacted by the research represented on NSF peer review panels evaluating research funding proposals?
Yeah, panels are always challenging. This is we want to make sure panels are diverse. And so for some people in the room, you may not understand how NSF works very well. So again, we're a big funding agency, and most of our funding is based on peer review panels. And so if people apply to my program, I'll get 10 or so scholars together, they'll review the proposal, and then we'll make funding decisions based on that. And so we obviously, by Claudia, we obviously want to have people who are experts in the field to making decisions about the research. That intellectual merit is a key part of what has to happen. So, but also we want to make sure we have people from across the spectrum on these panels. I don't want to have 10 people from Stony Brook on a panel. That would be a very bad panel. So, and I don't want to have 10 people from the top 10 universities in the country. I think that also is not a very good panel. And so my job is to try to find panelists from across the nation to serve. Now, we do get into some serious challenges. So one challenge is that some of the small universities, the professors there, their teaching load's so high, they don't actually have a chance to even get involved in these activities of like research and peer review panels, because they spend all their day, teaching 5 classes a semester, and they don't have time to do other things. And so that's one big challenge we face. I think it does take the individual. A lot of it falls on the individual program officers to go out and find people, and that takes time. And so it's very easy to rely on your network of scientists that you grew up with. If you went to a Stony Brook or St. Mary's, you're going to find people from St. Mary's in Stony Brook. And so you really do. It does take time and effort to say, no, what, I'm not going to get these people, but go off to different communities. It also will, I think, take some understanding that different knowledges can be different. As Sandra brought up in the very beginning, indigenous knowledge is important and interesting. It may not follow the traditional way they do it at St. Mary's, but it's something that we should consider and think about. And so having these communities on panels is very important. Traditionally, our panels don't have a community representative. Those people usually aren't on the panel as much. But that could be something we think about. If we have a project that really is geared towards the community, we should have people from that community on the panel, involved in the room to make decisions. So great question, Mark.
I've been thinking a little bit about these topics, especially like the last couple of weeks here as well. Like I do wonder if there isn't a bit of a common ground between you were talking about the backlash earlier and so on, but what you just mentioned, the having community members on panels. I mean, a mechanism like that, I'm imagining would be welcome by folks who are, let's say, pro EDI, if you like DEI, or and it would also, if you do it right, it would also, I think there are a lot of communities who are perhaps I don't know if they're against science or against the elitism. I mean, part of their grief with elitist scientists is that they're in their ivory towers, and there is no societal involvement. And actually, I think part of the ask there as well is let us in, take us seriously, hear us. So I'm wondering, what do you think? Is there a space where some of these kind of mechanisms might actually work for everybody?
Yeah, I think there is space, but I do think scientists ourselves have to humble ourselves. I always often bring this up with my students. Like, so you spend 6 years in graduate school, you spend a lot of time, and so you're telling me that you're called an expert for a reason, right? So why, if I'm very dogmatic, why shall I let these people into my panel? I spent the past 10 years studying this topic. I'm the expert. This is why I get paid the big bucks, biggish bucks to do the work, right? And so I do think it takes some humility amongst scientists saying, hey, yes, obviously you went to school for a long time. Yes, you have lots of knowledge, but you don't have all the knowledge. And there is other knowledge out there, another expertise that you may not see. And there's probably a lot of people walking around your hallways and my hallways that may not see it that way. And so getting them on board.
Yeah, no, I think there are, but I also see a lot of people walking the hallways going, we actually do want to serve community, society, and we do understand that we're funded by taxpayers. And quite frankly, I think a lot of my colleagues also like want to have impact.
Yeah.
And having impact is really so much easier if you understand society and where it's going to land and what is possible. So I'm actually thinking that yes, there's some folks who would struggle with that humility that you mentioned. But I also actually think that even among those, there's some who do want impact, and if we can come up with mechanisms that bring society closer to science, that might be welcomed by many.
Yeah. So.
Gita, I just saw you come up there. Did you?
Yeah, Gita, I know Gita
did
from
really, yeah.
we're colleagues from a long time. I think we were both graduate
Yeah.
students we met a long time ago.
Yeah, hello, how are you? I don't know why my video is not working. I just, I was in another meeting. I just wanted to pop in to say hi.
No, great. I'm glad you could come by. Yeah, so we're just talking about, right now we're kind of having a broad Q&A about DEI issues and those challenges, and also science funding in general, and how that works. In the Canadian context, how do your peer review panels work? How are you dealing with the issue of panels and funding and peer review? Are you trying to bring people from the community onto these panels, or is it very much still just the scientists involved?
Yeah,
Still just,
go ahead, Gita.
yeah, I think that it is mostly like from the Canadian side. It's still like we are moving there. We are, but yet still like most of the panels is mostly like scientists involved. It depends like which. Well, we are having like some citizen science work that, again, those projects that involve citizen science, they mostly involve like communities. But still, to my experience, is that mostly are experts.
Yeah, and I think Gita's right. Like it depends a little bit on the program. So for example, there are like explicit partnership programs. So SSHRC, like the social science, like so in Canada, we've got the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council looking at social science and humanities. And then we've got, and then we've got NSERC looking at natural sciences and engineering, and then we've got CHR looking at health sciences. So kind of depends a little bit. For SSHRC, for example, for the social sciences, there are partnership grant competitions. So they're a little different. So the inside grant competitions are just for research specifically, and I do believe those panels are pretty narrowly defined. But I do believe in the partnership grant application. I forget if they're actually on the panel or if there's a particular process to bring reviewers from industry, from community, and so into the decision making. So when we write those grants, we absolutely have to write it in a way that, number one, speaks to everybody. So it speaks to academic reviewers, but also the industry and community partners. So that is part of the process and needs to be involved there. And then the other piece, and Claudia had to unfortunately leave, but the other piece is that in our grant proposals, we explicitly have to address inclusiveness. Inclusiveness not only in a generic way, like as you mentioned earlier, like with the broader impacts, I think you were saying, people saying, oh, I'm including a graduate student, but it's actually it's getting more and more specific. So it needs to be inclusive in terms of the design of the research, needs to be inclusive in terms of the team. I should know this, but I forget what else, but it actually kind of goes through the entire project. And they actually do expect very specific language. So it's pretty central to the proposals at this point.
Great. Yeah.
I mean, the funny thing is, I've got to say, I'm not sure, like, with all the work that we're doing here in in this inclusive innovation community, it has happened to us like when I thought we had, like, honestly the most inclusive project I've ever seen. And we reached out on LinkedIn and made sure we reached far beyond our networks. We had diversity in terms of demographics and levels of experience and disciplines and all that. And then we got the comments back on our proposal, and they were telling us we weren't inclusive. And I'm like, okay, wait a sec, what is happening here? So I think so I think it is being built in the process, but I'm not sure that we all have the same read on it, or yeah, I think I don't know what's your, like, my sense is sometimes it's still kind of like a growing pains. And in the States, I mean, I'm not there, it sounds like it's a bit of a tug of war, and it kind of changes maybe with the panel as well. I don't know, where are you
Yeah.
at on that?
And that brings me an interesting point. The role and nature of peer review panels. I mean, so for example, we have these broader impact criteria, and most of the people in the panels are not experts in broader impacts. That's not what they're trained to do. So we have, the whole point of peer review is that you understand what's going on. You can judge the science of that project. And if you are requiring people to talk about community outreach or doing some type of development, you would need to make sure you have people on the panel who are experts in that area. Same thing if you have something with ethics, right? AI ethics, right? That's a big topic now. If you're going to do AI ethics, you better make sure you have an ethicist on the panel, because if not, then you're missing the whole point of there. So I think if you truly think peer review is the way to go, and we are going to include things like you must have some type of inclusive aspect to that proposal, then we should probably make sure that the panelists have some expertise on inclusion. So we should all hire Sandra to be on our panels, right? Or make sure she's
Yes,
because
all the
then
power to me. I'll make all the decisions any day.
exactly. But
Thank you.
because those people who know what, and also the challenges with it, it's easy to write something in a grant, but it's much harder to implement something. And so being mindful of those challenges is
yeah, and that comes back to Nell's point as well. Yes, for sure. So you mentioned AI a couple of times. I'm a little bit surprised nobody on the group here has jumped onto this. But so I think in Canada, we're actually not really technically allowed to, or like, international journals as well, actually are pretty allergic to researchers using AI to write anything. How's that playing out, though, from your perspective? How close are we to the scenario where, text is written by AI, assessed by AI, and where, like, the biases within that? Yeah.
So with AI, it's interesting. So how do we check it right now? So like I'm reading reading proposals right now, and I don't run the proposals through any type of AI checker, right? That they could write it with all AI. Now, I think AI still has trouble with citations, and so the scientists who read these things do actually care about citations, as you all know. We actually do care about what science you're citing and how you're dealing with it. So I think it's still going to struggle with some of those issues, and it's going to struggle, of course, developing new and unique ideas. I have no doubt that many of our proposals are edited by AI. They'll put something in, write it first, and say, okay, flesh this out, give me more text for it. And so I do think that stuff is happening. That's on the writing side of it, and so it's hard for me to flag that. If I see citations are bad or weird, then of course that's a little not so good. But I guess kind of like how we do with our students, right? I'm sure all of us have students, and how do we incorporate AI into our classrooms? And I personally think it's too late to roll that back. It's there, and so we have to teach with it and make sure people know how to use it wisely. So that's one aspect of it.
Yeah, Louise was asking actually to contribute here. Do you think AI methods will improve impact assessments for the panels? Could that support the panels?
Yeah, and that's what's well, one of my projects I was actually trying to do that. I was going to try, and that's when once I finish my current job at the NSF, when I leave, I may go back and write a paper using AI to evaluate proposals. Because I think some of these language models can do some coding, as opposed to me reading 400 grants. I can get the AI to read and code them for me. I think you'll still need some, as I think in terms of research methods, I think it's still important to have a human in the loop to do coding, intercode reliability. I think you need intercode reliability. And if the AI is reliable as a human, then maybe that could kind of turbocharge your ability to review lots of grants or review lots of text data. You know, I'm seeing lots of proposals on AI and AI methods. You know, using AI for science basically take any topic and throw on AI and you have a proposal. Now, my job is to kind of screen that and say, okay, just because you tack on AI doesn't make it good science. I mean, are you doing something new and original, or do you think it's new and original just because you use ChatGPT to look at the text data? And I think that's where you'll see good science versus kind of, not very good science, or transformative science, is how they use AI. But it obviously it could be something very useful in many fields. You're seeing, okay, it can really crank through lots of information very quickly and give you some very good results. So stay tuned.
Fun fact here to throw into the conversation. So of course I'm playing around with AI, right? So and actually I'm going to say I do find it useful in kind of going back and forth on a proposal as to, kind of like try this out, try that. What would this, and then of course then I go on and write it myself, because as you said, references are just not, it can't handle them. The fun fact is, so I was playing around and it did give me references. And I was looking at them and and I'm going, whoa, these papers are so on target. How could I have missed them? And okay, took me a little too long to realize, yes, they were made up. But then I went through those made up papers and I was looking like at them going, these are totally papers we should have written. Like, honestly. So if anybody's looking for research ideas, get get the AI tool to make you up some text and the titles. I mean, honestly, those were projects we should have done.
There you go. So it's helpful. It is helpful to generate ideas. Again, I use it often. Interestingly enough, we can't use it with government stuff. So they don't want us putting, like,
Yes.
if I get a proposal, I can't then upload that to ChatGPT and say, okay, what do you think of this thing? Because proposals are proprietary and it's intellectual property. And so who knows when you upload this thing into the system, who owns it and things like that. So they're very careful about that. So there's no ChatGPT on my government computer.
Yeah. No, for sure. No, that's something we who are submitting these can play with, because it's our own stuff. Can I? So hold on, there's one more question from Louise here. Time to impact is a very important issue for assessing science. Do you think AI will assist in shortening the time for research results to have impact?
It could. Good question. It could. I'm not sure. I mean, my skeptical side on is that I think people may rely too much on AI, thinking if we just have AI, it'll solve all of our problems. And I don't think you're saying this, Luis, but I think that's, if people aren't careful, they will rely on AI, thinking, oh, I'll write this grant, I'll do something, and I'll have AI do it, and it'll just solve it. But we talked about the biases there, and so if we're too heavy on AI, I think we can actually increase some of these challenges we're facing, some of these inequalities, because we're not considering the full range of things. And so I do hope it's a useful tool to speed things up. In my presentation, there was probably 4 or 5 images that were created through AI image generation. I just say, create image of DI, and it created it for me. So that sped up things a lot. And so maybe if that happens in small scales, you can definitely see the impacts reaching people more. So yeah, and I guess it also depends on the type of impact. You know, some impacts are boots on the ground, shovel in hand. You got to do something. It's hard to speed those up. But other impacts, hey, create a marketing campaign to reach students in about the benefits of climate change, or the downsides of climate change, right? You know, with that, you might be able to have a ChatGPT model to draft you a policy brief, draft you a picture and image, create some slides, reach the community, and that actually is impact that's sped up by AI. So I think you can see it depending on the type of impact you're trying to have.
Yeah, actually super interesting. That ties in. There's a bit of a private side conversation happening here as well, on, when that goes right to where you were going there, in the sense that, okay, so if the goal is to be inclusive, isn't the whole point to include those communities rather than an AI tool? But on the other hand, is there tension there where maybe actually these processes de-skill inclusiveness, so it becomes easier for people to be more inclusive? I think that's kind of what you're speaking to a little bit there too. Okay, so I think we could go on here forever, and there are conversations going on. I think they will be going on, and really appreciate Thomas, your presentation, your thought. Love your model. I think it's super compelling, as I said earlier, and lots of uses for it. So really appreciate you sharing that and sharing your thoughts, and being here for the discussion conversation. Really appreciate that. We are getting kind of to the bottom of the hour. We do want to leave here on time. As y'all leave, I'd like to just, Thomas, if you let me just point everybody to the i2Hub website, i2hub.ca. You will be able to see the recording there, and we're also yes, thank you, and we're also working on getting YouTube channel up, so we'll have this recording up on the YouTube channel, and you can follow up on that as well. And then for everybody, next event is in January, so we're kind of, as Thomas was saying earlier, getting into the holiday season. This is not only in the States, I think. The next event for us is in January, so the conversations will continue, taking a little bit of a break. So January 15th is our next event. Looking forward to Dan Monroe to give us more Canadian perspective this time. We're switching it up. And he will speak on the experience with an Inclusive Innovation Initiative here in Canada. So thank you everybody for being here. Thomas, thank you again. Really appreciate the conversation. I could go, honestly, I still have like points and questions. I could go on forever.
It was my pleasure. Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me. And again, hopefully sometime in the near future I'll be there live and I can have other conversations with you in Ottawa. So I do thank you for
we would very much look forward to that, and hope we can find out a way to make that happen. Thank you, and thank you everybody for being here, for all your comments, questions, contributions, all the chat going on. Really appreciate it. Yeah. Oh, that outro was actually shorter than I thought, but anyways, thank you everybody, and we will see you next time.